Do you remember the sexual revolution? Now, before you answer, you should probably ask, which one? In our generation, we typically think of the 1960s and 70s, the hippie years, free love, sexual liberation. But before that, there were the Roaring Twenties, and it was called the Roaring Twenties for good reason. Before that, the late 1800s, 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the movement away from the Victorian era, a very strict age of morality and propriety. And as you go throughout history, you'll find that time and time again, there are periods in which society is radically changing its views regarding sex. In fact, you could even speak of the sexual revolution that took place in the Roman Empire when Christianity became the dominant force, when emperors became Christians, and they passed laws actually heading the right direction in regards to sex. You see, society's attitude towards sex is always changing. What is illegal one day can be legal another day. What is proper may one day be improper, and it changes back and forth all throughout time. That's why so many people resist the idea of the church speaking about a set of rules for sexual ethics. Because as far as society is concerned, it always changes depending upon what people want it to be. In fact, the general attitude is, it doesn't really matter what people do when it comes to sex. It's just sex. They're just having fun. And as long as no one gets hurt, what does it really matter? Now, when I look in the scriptures, looking for an ethics of sex, here's what I discover. It is remarkably unchanging. Whether you're talking what is said in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, it's going to be the same. All through the centuries of biblical history, the millennia after millennia of biblical history, God's word remains constant in what God says regarding sex. That's one of the benefits of studying the book of Leviticus. It takes you way, way back to the old days, an ancient set of rules regarding sex. And when you hear what Moses says then, it sounds a lot like what the apostles will later say in the New Testament age. In fact, it sounds a lot like what many of us grew up with in church, the traditional teaching of the church. Now, when Moses gave his rules in Leviticus, he does it twice. Chapter 18, and then he repeats in chapter 20, same rules. The first time in chapter 18 is just the basic rule. Thou shalt not do this or do that. In chapter 20, it's the same rules again, but this time with penalties attached. Probably good for us to hear it twice so that we'll get it. Now, when Moses wrote those rules, it was in the typical negative fashion. Thou shalt not. Don't do this. And before we get into that, let me first begin with something positive about sex. Let me talk about sexual purity. You hear that word purity, it brings to mind something good, wholesome, healthy, right, something that hasn't been tainted by sin and corruption. You know, in the Beatitudes of Jesus, one that stands out for me, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Now, when it comes to being pure in regards to sex, that simply means to do what is right according to God's standard. God says this is right, this is wrong. Sexual purity is to do what God says is right and avoid what he says is wrong, that which is sinful. It's like what Paul said to the young preacher Timothy. He says, when you're dealing with the young women in your church, he says, treat the younger women as sisters with purity. Now, let me give you a simple rule regarding sex as far as the scriptures teach, and that is this. Sexual activity belongs in the marriage of a man and woman. I use Hebrews 13:4 as my key text. I like it because it's so short, sweet, and to the point. You should remember this passage as well. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage should be held in honor and respect by all. The marriage bed should be kept pure. Now, the phrase marriage bed, that's a nice, polite way of talking about the sexual intimacy of a husband and wife in marriage. And he says that should be kept pure. And the rest of the verse, he mentions things that make it impure. God will judge the adulterer, the sexually immoral. I'll speak of those later. Now, Hebrews says this is the way God intended it. The marriage bed is a good thing. Don't corrupt that. I take you back to Genesis chapter 2, the beginning of man and woman. You can see God's creation design for sex and marriage. Verse 22 tells the story of how God took a rib from Adam and made the woman, brought the woman to the man, And then Adam said, she's now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. I'm going to call her woman because she was taken from the man. But then Moses stops in verse 24 and gives an editorial comment for his people to understand that this is where marriage began. Moses says, this is why a man will leave his father and his mother, be united to his wife, and they become one flesh. This union of man and woman as husband and wife in marriage, Moses says it began right there. And he says, and they become one flesh, which probably captures in heart and soul and mind, but certainly it captures the physical, flesh upon flesh, sexual intimacy. All of that ordained by God in the beginning. It says in verse 25 of Genesis 2, Adam and his wife were both naked, and yet they felt no shame. Naked and exposed, and yet in that context of husband and wife, there was nothing to be ashamed of. They had a sense of purity. Now, sexual purity, that's a good thing in the scriptures. Let me flip that around. Sexual immorality. That's the opposite of sexual purity. Now, here's a good way of understanding what sexual immorality means. Any sexual activity outside of what God designed and intended for sex, that's going to be sexual immorality. It's going to be unholy in the eyes of God. So start with the basic idea that God created sex to be in marriage, of a man and woman as husband and wife, the marriage bed. That's what he designed and intended. You take it outside of that, and that's sexual immorality. Now what you could do is use your own imagination and start making a list of all the other kinds of sex that's out there, and that would be immoral. And if you don't want to bother making the list, let the scriptures do it for you, because that's what they do. That's what Moses is doing in Leviticus. So sexual immorality, that's any sexual activity outside of what God intended and designed, what he showed you with Adam and Eve. Or to put it a different way, it's any sexual activity that he specifically prohibits in his word, like what Moses does in his list. Now that brings me to a Greek word I want you to know, the Greek word porneia. Now you can already guess, that's where we get the word pornography, but it means much more than that. The Greek word porneia was used by the Greeks to refer to any sex act that was banned by law. And the Romans, they were very free in their sexual activity, but they had some things they said no to. Rape and assault was against the law. It was porneia. You see, man will sometimes create rules regarding sex, and the things they ban, they would have called them porneia. God does the same thing. In the scriptures, God will tell you sex acts that he bans, he prohibits, and the Greek word in your scriptures will be porneia. Translated in English Bibles, you'll see the word fornication, or maybe modern translations, illicit sex, sexual immorality. When you see those English words, it's the word porneia. This is what has been banned by God. Now, Leviticus 18 and 20 is Moses giving you a porneia list. He's given you a list of sex acts that God has banned. God says, thou shalt not. Now, these are things that will make sex impure, immoral, unholy. As Moses gave his list and then wrapped up the list in Leviticus 18, he concludes by saying this, do not defile yourself in any of these ways, because that's how the nations before you became defiled. Doing these things is contrary to sexual purity. It's contrary to holiness. Now, you may say, yeah, but still, we're going a long ways back to find rules about sex. Couldn't we find something more recent, like in the New Testament? Well, go to the Jerusalem Council, Acts chapter 15. This is where you had the apostles and the elders of the Church of Jerusalem and some other church leaders, and they're trying to determine what rules in the Old Testament law of Moses are they going to still require today. For Gentile Christians especially coming into the church, what do they want them to know from the laws of Moses? Now they came up with three things. They said that no eating foods associated with idols. That's the foreign god rules of Leviticus. I'll show you those later. No drinking blood. That's the slaughtered meat rules of Leviticus. I'll show that to you later. And then they said no sexual immorality. Use the word porneia. No porneia. That is, anything that Moses said no to in regards to sex. The Jerusalem Council said, we're still going to say no to it. We're not going to allow those things. You see, they carried over what Moses taught. So we need to go back to Moses, to chapter 18 and 20, and find out what did Moses prohibit? Now, some will say, oh no, it's not worth all of our time because after all, regardless of what we want, what we like, what we approve or disapprove of, people are still going to do whatever they want to do. In fact, sometimes our attitude towards sexual freedom is, it doesn't matter because everybody's doing it. Well, folks, not everybody's doing it, nor should they. Because that's the challenge that we get from the book of Leviticus. The challenge to be different, be better, be holy.